When betrayal and deadly ambition collide, a Sheriff Robert Hayes' life is shattered by the very people he trusted most. Why did his wife turn against him, and how did their love spiral into murder? October 10th, 2012. Timber Creek, Wyoming, Sheriff Robert Hayes, a commanding presence with salt and pepper hair and eyes that missed nothing, had served Timber Creek for nearly 2 decades. Respected and feared, he was the backbone of the community. His wife Claire was known to all, graceful, intelligent, and always quick with a smile that could light up any room. But smiles can hide darkness. The Sheriff's Department had organized an annual retreat, a tradition meant to strengthen bonds and relieve the stresses of the job. They gathered at a secluded lodge deep in the forest. It was remote, miles from the main road, and shielded from prying eyes. On the surface, it was a weekend of camaraderie and good spirits. Beneath it, tension simmered. That Friday, October 12th, the retreat began with laughter and drinks around a roaring fire. Claire moved among the deputies, her laughter echoing in the night air. Robert watched her from a distance, unable to shake an uneasy feeling. He trusted her, didn't he? Yet, recently she had become distant, her attention slipping away from him like water through fingers. Deputy Mark Collins, a tall, confident man in his early 30s, with a penchant for charming those around him, stood by the fire, a drink in hand. He was popular among his peers and often the center of attention. Next to him was Deputy James Holloway, older, reserved but sharp-eyed and respected. Mark raised his glass, his gaze drifting toward Claire. She laughed at something he whispered, and Robert felt the first pang of doubt. October 13th, day 2 of the retreat morning, came with a chill that bit through coats and skin. The group split up for team-building exercises. Robert stayed close to Claire, trying to recapture a connection that seemed to be slipping. But every time his gaze strayed, he found Mark and Claire exchanging glances, quick, subtle, but enough to stoke the embers of his suspicion. James noticed too. His eyes met Robert's with a silent warning: tread carefully. By evening, the tension grew unbearable. Drinks flowed again, loosening inhibitions. The fire crackled as stories were told and laughter roared. Claire excused herself, claiming she needed fresh air. Moments later, Mark slipped away too. Robert's jaw clenched, and he waited a few heartbeats before following. Outside, the night was dark and still. He moved silently, his breath visible in the frosty air. He heard hushed voices around the corner of the lodge, a conversation carried by desperation and familiarity. He edged closer, keeping his presence hidden. Claire's voice, tinged with both anger and sorrow, reached him first. "It has to stop, Mark. This was a mistake." Mark's tone was sharp, desperate. "We can't just pretend it didn't happen. I won't." A cold rage washed over Robert. It was more than he feared. He stepped back, his mind spinning. Betrayal burned hot in his veins, and as he returned to the fire, he forced himself to act normal, to hide what he knew. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not yet. October 14th, the retreat's final day. Dawn broke with a heavy fog hanging low over the forest. Deputies packed up, ready to leave behind the weekend's activities and return to their lives. But for Robert, there was no going back. He watched Mark carefully, every movement, every word. Claire avoided him, her guilt written on her face. He confronted her privately before they left the lodge. "Is there something you need to tell me?" His voice was cold, devoid of emotion. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes. The ride home was a quiet, suffocating prison. October 20th. For a week, Robert buried his feelings, trying to focus on work. But rumors began to circulate among the deputies, whispers of secrets, glances that lingered too long. He knew he wasn't the only one who had noticed. James Holloway approached him one night at the station. "You need to watch your back," he said, his tone grave. "Things aren't what they seem." "What do you know?" Robert demanded, his voice low but deadly serious. "Not here," James replied, glancing around the empty hall. "Tomorrow night. We need to talk." The next evening, under the cover of darkness, Robert met James at an old hunting cabin miles from town. What he learned there would change everything. October 21st, 2012. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain. Sheriff Robert Hayes and Deputy James Holloway sat across from each other in the dim light of the hunting cabin, the tension between them as thick as the storm clouds overhead. Robert's eyes, once clear and commanding, were now dark with suspicion and fury. "Tell me everything," Robert demanded, his jaw clenched. James leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "It's not just an affair, Robert. Mark's been using his relationship with Claire to dig into department affairs. He's been feeding information to people who shouldn't have it, people who stand to gain a lot from your downfall." Robert's hands tightened into fists. He felt the walls closing in on him. "Why?" "Power, influence," James replied grimly. "And Claire, she's more involved than you think. She's not just a pawn in this." The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. He had hoped, even in his darkest moments, that Claire had been manipulated, that she wasn't as complicit. But now, there was no denying it. Betrayal, both personal and professional, ran deeper than he'd ever imagined. "Why are you telling me this?" Robert asked, suspicion lacing his words. James hesitated, his eyes hard. "Because you're still my sheriff, and because this has gone too far." Robert nodded slowly. His mind raced with plans, revenge and justice battling for dominance. "We'll deal with this," he said, his voice icy. "I'll deal with them." October 23rd, 2012. Robert returned home that night, the weight of what he'd learned pressing down on him. He found Claire in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. She looked up, her smile forced, as if she could sense his simmering rage. "How was your evening?" she asked lightly, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "Fine," he replied coldly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Just had a meeting." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Claire turned away, pretending to busy herself with the dishes. Robert's gaze hardened. He couldn't pretend anymore. "Are you going to keep lying to me, Claire?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. She froze, her back to him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she turned around. "What are you talking about?" "You and Mark, don't play dumb," Robert spat. "I know everything." Claire's face went pale. "It's not what you think," she whispered, but the words rang hollow. "Don't lie to me," he snapped, stepping closer. "You've been betraying me in more ways than one." Claire's hands trembled as she set down the glass. "I had no choice." "There's always a choice," Robert growled, his voice filled with equal parts rage and pain. Claire's eyes flashed with desperation. "It's more complicated than you know. If you would just listen—" "I'm done listening," Robert said, his voice hard. "You and Mark will pay for what you've done." Fear flickered across Claire's face, quickly replaced by something colder, more calculating. "You don't understand, Robert. You're in over your head. If you keep pushing, this won't end well. For any of us." Robert stepped back, disgust curling his lip. "Is that a threat?" "Consider it a warning," she replied, her voice steadier now. "You don't know who you're dealing with." October 25th, 2012. Over the next few days, Robert worked tirelessly to gather evidence against Mark and Claire. He trusted no one but James, keeping their investigation secret. But he underestimated how far Claire would go to protect herself and her lover. Late one night, Robert returned home to find the house eerily quiet. Claire was waiting for him in the living room, a glass of wine in one hand. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "We need to talk," she said, her voice smooth but edged with something he couldn't place. "I have nothing to say to you," Robert replied, his tone icy. "Oh, I think you do," she said, standing and walking toward him. "You've been digging, haven't you?" Robert's eyes narrowed. "I'm not stopping," she sighed, a sad smile playing on her lips. "I hoped it wouldn't come to this." Before he could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind. Mark stepped into the room, his eyes cold and calculating. Robert reached for his sidearm, but Claire was faster. She drew a gun from beneath her jacket and aimed it at him, her hands trembling only slightly. "Claire, don't do this," Robert said, his voice laced with disbelief and heartbreak. "You don't have to—" "Stop!" she snapped, her voice cracking. "You brought this on yourself. You couldn't just leave it alone." Mark stepped closer, a cruel smile on his lips. "It's over, Sheriff." Robert's mind raced. He had faced death countless times, but this was different. This was betrayal at its most personal, its most brutal. "You think killing me will solve your problems?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The gunshot echoed through the house, piercing the silence. Robert staggered backward, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. He fell to the floor, his vision blurring as the world darkened around him. Mark stepped over him, a satisfied smirk on his face. "Goodbye, Sheriff." Claire turned away, unable to watch. As Robert's life slipped away, the weight of her choices crashed down on her. There was no turning back now. October 26th, 2012. The sun rose reluctantly over Timber Creek, casting pale light over a town unaware of the violence that had torn through one of its own. Inside the Hayes home, blood stained the floorboards where Sheriff Robert Hayes had fallen the night before. Claire and Mark moved quickly, their faces pale and their hands trembling as they attempted to cover their tracks. "Get rid of the body," Mark hissed, his voice low and urgent. "We can't afford any mistakes." Claire's hands shook as she nodded. This was not how it was supposed to end. She had crossed lines she once thought unbreakable. Love, lust, fear. It all blurred together in a twisted mess. They dragged Robert's lifeless body to a tarp, wrapping it tightly. Every motion felt mechanical, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. As dawn broke, they loaded the tarp into the back of Mark's truck, their faces set in grim determination. The plan was simple but desperate. Make it look like Robert had gone missing during an early morning patrol. It would buy them time, if nothing else. October 28th, 2012. 2 days later, Robert's disappearance sent shockwaves through the town. Deputies and townsfolk alike organized search parties, combing the woods and riversides. Claire played the role of the worried wife, her eyes red from grief. Mark led a group of deputies, barking orders and maintaining a mask of professionalism. But one man was not convinced. Deputy James Holloway knew Robert better than anyone. He had noticed Robert's increasing paranoia and the tension between him and Claire. Something wasn't right. When Claire's tears seemed forced and Mark avoided eye contact, James's suspicion grew. That night, James knocked on Claire's door. She opened it, her face pale. "Deputy Holloway," she greeted, forcing a smile. "I need to talk," he said, stepping inside uninvited. "It's about Robert." Claire's hand tightened around the doorframe. "I've already told you everything I know." James studied her, his gaze piercing. "You're hiding something." She laughed, a hollow sound. "I'm grieving, James. My husband is missing." "Is he?" James asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Or did you and Mark have something to do with it?" Her eyes flashed with panic for a split second before she regained control. "You're out of line." "Maybe," James said, taking a step closer, "but I won't stop until I find out what really happened." Claire forced a calm smile. "Good luck with that." As James left, she closed the door, her hands shaking. Mark, who had been listening from the shadows, stepped forward. He knows. "We'll deal with him," Claire whispered, fear and desperation flickering across her face. October 30th, 2012. Determined to find the truth, James began his own investigation. He quietly retraced Robert's last steps, speaking with anyone who had seen him in his final days. He uncovered a trail of secrets that pointed directly at Mark and Claire, but he needed proof. James devised a plan. He would lure Mark into a meeting under the pretense of needing his help to keep things quiet. He hoped the offer of a shared secret would draw Mark out. That evening, in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, James waited. Mark arrived, his eyes wary. "What's this about?" he asked, sliding into the booth. "I know you were close to Robert," James began, keeping his tone neutral. "I also know things have been tense lately. People are asking questions." Mark leaned back, his expression guarded. "Get to the point." James leaned in, lowering his voice. "I need to know what really happened. If there's anything you're hiding, it's better to tell me now. I can protect you." For a moment, Mark said nothing. Then a slow, cold smile spread across his face. "You're a terrible liar, James." James's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" "You think I don't know you've been digging?" Mark said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're out of your depth." James swallowed hard. "Maybe, but I won't stop." Mark's smile vanished. "Then you're a problem." Before James could react, Mark lunged. The two men struggled, fists flying and chairs crashing to the floor. The bar erupted in chaos. James managed to break free, drawing his sidearm. "It's over, Mark. Surrender." But Mark's eyes were wild. "It's never over." He bolted, disappearing into the night. James knew then that he had underestimated the depth of Mark's desperation and the danger he posed. November 1st, 2012. Claire paced the living room, her mind racing. The walls were closing in. Mark's recklessness was becoming a liability. She had thought they could manage this together, but now the weight of their crimes was crushing her. James was relentless, and Mark was unraveling. Late that night, Mark burst into the house, his face flushed and wild. "We need to leave, now!" Claire shook her head. "Running will only make it worse." "There's no time," he shouted, grabbing her arm. "James is onto us. If we stay, we're dead." Claire pulled away. "I can't do this anymore." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare turn on me now." "I'm not turning," she said, her voice cracking. "But this has to end." His expression hardened. "Then we end it our way." He stepped closer, menace in his eyes. Claire realized with chilling clarity that she had created a monster, and now she had to stop him. November 2nd, 2012. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in shadows. Claire sat alone at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee untouched before her. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, suffocating. She thought of Robert, the way he used to smile, the warmth that had once filled their home. Now, all she felt was the crushing guilt of what she had done. The door slammed open and Mark stormed in. His clothes were dirty, his eyes wild with desperation. "They're closing in," he said, pacing like a caged animal. "We have to make our move." Claire stared at him, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "It's over, Mark. Running will only make it worse." "You think surrendering will save us?" he snapped. "James won't stop until we're behind bars or dead." Claire stood, her voice calm but firm. "I'm done, Mark. I won't run anymore." He stepped closer, his jaw clenched. "You think you can just walk away, after everything we've done?" "Yes," she whispered. "I have to." In a flash, Mark's demeanor shifted from desperation to cold rage. "You're a liability." Claire's blood ran cold. She realized then that Mark was willing to do anything to protect himself, even kill her. November 3rd, 2012. James Holloway stood outside the Hayes' home, his breath visible in the cold morning air. He had spent days piecing together the truth, and now, with enough evidence to confront Claire and Mark, he knew it was time to end this. Backup was on the way, but he couldn't wait. Too much was at stake. Inside, tension crackled like a live wire. Mark paced, a gun in his hand. Claire watched him warily, every nerve on edge. "You don't have to do this," she pleaded. "Shut up," he snarled. "It's too late for that." Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Mark tensed, his grip tightening on the weapon. "Who is it?" he demanded. "It's Deputy Holloway," came James's steady voice. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Mark's eyes flicked to Claire, filled with a mix of fear and fury. "Did you call him?" "No," she whispered, terrified. James spoke again, louder this time. "It's over, Mark. Come out and no one else has to get hurt." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "No one else?" It's too late for that. He pulled Claire close, the barrel of his gun pressed against her temple. "You want me, Holloway? Come and get me." James pushed the door open slowly, his hands raised. His eyes met Claire's, and he saw the fear, the regret. "Let her go, Mark," he said calmly. "This doesn't have to end like this." Mark's grip tightened. "You think you can talk me down? You don't know anything." "I know you're scared," James said, stepping closer, "but this isn't the way. Let her go, and we'll figure it out." Claire's eyes met James's, pleading silently. She took a shaky breath and made a decision. In one swift motion, she twisted out of Mark's grasp, knocking the gun aside. The weapon discharged, the deafening crack reverberating through the house. Chaos erupted. James lunged forward, tackling Mark to the ground. They struggled, fists flying, until the gun skidded across the floor. Claire grabbed it, her hands shaking as she aimed it at Mark. "Claire!" James said, his voice urgent. "Don't!" Mark sneered, blood trickling from his lip. "You don't have the guts." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Claire's finger hovered over the trigger. The weight of everything she had done, the lies, the betrayal, the blood on her hands, crashed down on her. Tears streamed down her face as she lowered the gun. Mark laughed bitterly. "You're weak." Before he could lunge at her again, James delivered a swift punch, knocking him unconscious. The room fell silent except for Claire's ragged breathing. November 5th, 2012. Mark was taken into custody, charged with murder, conspiracy, and a host of other crimes. Claire, broken and haunted by guilt, turned herself in. She confessed to everything: the affair, the lies, and her role in Robert's death. In the end, she chose to face justice, hoping it might bring some measure of peace. James Holloway stood by as Claire was led away in handcuffs. He felt no triumph, only a heavy sadness. Timber Creek would never be the same. The town's trust had been shattered, and the scars would remain for years to come. In the months that followed, the story of Sheriff Robert Hayes's murder became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how love, greed, and betrayal can twist even the strongest bonds. Claire's life was ruined by the choices she made, and Mark's desperation led him down a path of destruction. Justice was served, but at a heavy price. James visited Robert's grave one last time, placing a hand on the cold stone. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I tried." The wind rustled the leaves around him, carrying away his words into the vast, unforgiving silence of Timber Creek.